And thank you, Michael, for those words. I have to confess I'm not absolutely sure how you qualify to be an alumnus. I mean, does it mean that you have graduated necessarily? I'm not sure. So I of course, looked up in the dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, needless to say, the short Oxford English Dictionary. And then I discovered that an alumnus comes from a Latin word, which means a foster child or even a nursling, believe it or not. Well, now, I may or may not have qualified as a graduate, or most of you, I dare say, have. But I can say that I was a foster child, if not indeed a nursling, for I went to Leicester University College, as it then was, when I was 5 in 1931. And then it was a very different place from what it is now. There were less than 100. There were 40, 50 students, that's all. And the only building was the central building, which you will be called or know as the Fielding Johnson building. It was a wonderful place to be a boy, because at that time, that building, that noble building, indeed it is a noble building. We lived in College House, which is just, if you're facing the building, the facade is just on the left-hand side there. And we were surrounded by lawns. We had beautiful trees. There was a wonderful horse chestnut immediately opposite. There was a huge copper beech on the side towards Victoria Park. I spent days climbing around in those trees and making houses for myself and sending messages to my mother by throwing paper things wrapped around a pebble to say when I wanted lunch and so on. I had an absolutely fabulous time. And there was a pond. If you're looking at the front of the Fielding Johnson building, on the right-hand side, just go down a bit, there was a pond. And it was immediately outside the zoology department, which was run by a lady, I thought a most beautiful lady, called Dr. Anne Hosker. And I discovered that she was doing research on newts. Newts. What is more, she was offering 6pence a newt. And I know where I could get a lot of newts. That is to say, 10 yards outside her lab in the pond. So I supplied her with newts for quite a long time. And whether she knew that they came from her pond, I don't know. I suspect that she was a very nice and generous lady and supported this young boy, 8-year-old, making his first few bob from wildlife, a habit that I've maintained ever since. But of course, that building was built in the 1860s, 1840s, 50s, as a lunatic asylum. And it was an old Victorian building, of course, and I started exploring in that extraordinary building, because underneath the Fielding Johnson building, there was a labyrinth of cellars. And there was antique Victorian engineering in there for the heating of the place. And I knew how I could get in through one grating and find my way with a candle to another one on the other side of the building altogether. So I learned my first excitements of exploration in the cellars of your university. But it was, of course, built as a lunatic asylum in the 1870s, 1860s. And when my father went there in the 30s, only a part of the Fielding Johnson building was occupied. The first half, on the left-hand block, going down from the main building, was occupied by a library, the university library as it then was. And beyond there was a green baize door. And you could open the door if you knew how, which I did, and you could go into the other half of this building. And there was the Victorian lunatic asylum, untouched. There was a padded cell, a horrifying place, actually, because when you opened the door, the sides and the ceiling, there was no window. The ceiling and the door itself was padded. So once you were in there, when the door was shut, nobody could hear you. And needless to say, my dear elder brother shut me in. And I can tell you, not a pleasant experience. And I'll add one further short story about that part of the library, of Fielding Johnson building. Our house, College House, was adjoining the main block. And my father said to me one Sunday evening, "My son," he said, I've left some papers in the library, some of the journals that I want to consult. Would you go over and pick them up for me? And I said, of course, I would. But I took with me our dog, an Irish setter called Shears, who I adored. And we set off, and we went into the main door. And of course, a building like that, huge building, but totally empty, is quite a scary place. I went up the stairs, turned left, then I turned right, and there was the door to the library, and I could see it had a glass in it. I could see the papers my father wanted on the librarian's desk. And I took out the key, the latch to open the door, and I looked down to see where Shears was. And Shears was beside my side, and as I put my hand down, his lips were already drawn back over his teeth, and he went to snap at my fingers, and then he shot howling down the corridor. I opened the door very gingerly, and I reached over the threshold, just managed to get the papers. Then I followed him. And I have to tell you, it was an experience that stayed with me, as you can see, ever since that time, which makes me wonder about things. And that particular part of the building, which was still full of those Victorian dramas, which you can read about in Dickens, but which, thank God, have at least disappeared from our knowing and experience. So it was an extraordinary childhood, built up, spent in a place which you all know as part, at least, of your university experience. My father, during my life, during my time there, of course, it was during the war, following the war, and the wartime. And the university was necessarily prevented from growing. But soon after the war, Philip Larkin, a poet of the later 20th century, a lot of people think actually a great poet of the second half of the 20th century, Philip Larkin was working as an assistant librarian. And he wrote a note about what the university was like in that time, which I might read to you. He said, everyone knew everybody else. The atmosphere was almost familial. The staff lunched together in what was called the outer hall. The first two courses were brought by waitresses, But the two puddings were put in front of the principal and the vice principal, who sat at opposite ends of the table and served their colleagues. The conversation was genial. "What's in that jug?" one senior member of the staff asked. "Not what you hope," replied another. But when I finally left in 1950, my thoughts were on the future rather than the present. It certainly did occur to me that I had belonged to an academic community of a kind soon to be superseded, but with virtues that in time would seem very precious. That is the sort of reflection that comes the best part of 25 years later. And he was writing in 1975. And that was how I knew the University College of Leicester when I was a boy. It was truly a remarkable institution. It was formed, of course, by one of the great Victorian societies of the 19th century, which spread across England, a literary and philosophical society, which had all kinds of sections, botany sections, geology sections, English sections. And they were marvelous institutions where scholarship and learning were greatly valued. And the literary and philosophical society started agitating that the great city of Leicester was so great that it really should have a university. And you have already heard mentioned by the Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Astley Clark. He was, in fact, a Leicester boy. He was educated at Wiggiston Grammar School, Leicester, and he became one of the most distinguished physician, doctor in Leicester. But he was a man of culture, and he was president of the Lytton Phil. And again, he agitated with the society, that they should have a university, or at least a university college. And he went to another great benefactor, a man with great civic pride called Fielding Johnson. And Fielding Johnson belonged to a family of textile manufacturers. He was wealthy. But he was a strange and, from all accounts, rather secretive character. But he did have a lot of money, and he was very generous. And Dr. Astley Clark went to him in the 30s and said, no, I beg your pardon, in the 40s, just after the war. I'm wrong, in the 30s, just after the war. And he said to Fielding Johnson, I have a great idea. I think that Leicester City should commemorate the fallen from the 1418 war by founding a university in their name. And Fielding Johnson remained dumb. And Astley Clark said, but don't you think it's a great idea? And Fielding Johnson said, you can't do it. You cannot buy the Leicester Mental Infirmary, or hospital as it then was. You cannot do it. And Astley Clark said, we can and we must. Why can't we, he said. And Fielding Johnson said, you can't do it because I've just bought it. And I wish it to be the foundation for a university, for Leicester's university. And so it came to pass. And so it is that that building is called the Fielding Johnson Building. And so it is you have an Astley Clark building, very right and proper that you should do so. My father's responsibility, he was in fact an Anglo-Saxon scholar, and he had been a fellow of Emmanuel College in Cambridge where he got his degree. But he was a very, very firm believer in what was then called red brick universities. And he was proud to be part of this university college, which at that time was not a university. It was an independent institution that got its credentials and its academic standards from the University of London, which is why it was called a university college. And my father was dedicated to the proposition that University College Leicester deserved to have its own university. And part of his job was to go round the prominent citizens of Leicester and persuade them to help financially to found this infant suckling university with less than 100 undergraduates so that it could be strong enough to become a university in its own right. And I remember those days. And in addition to us, I knew Astley Clark quite well. I knew Percy G, who was also a very distinguished and very philanthropic citizen of Leicester. And also there was a gentleman called Sir Jonathan North, who was in shoes, Freeman Hardy and Willis, manufacturing the shoes. And he was a charming old man. All these people, Percy G, Astley Clark, Jonathan North, would turn up at the house, Leicester College House. And sometimes me and my brother Dick and my younger brother John, we would be put on parade to say goodbye or to greet these distinguished figures. And I remember one occasion when Sir Jonathan North turned up. He was a very distinguished figure with a silver beard. Not a tall man, but a very impressive man with huge presence. And my father said, "This is Sir Jonathan North." And Sir Jonathan, to my huge pleasure, reached in his pocket and took out a half-crown. Now, a half-crown was 2 shillings and 6pence, and it was 5 times my weekly pocket money. So I looked at it and I said, "Thank you, Saint Jonathan." And he said, "Saint Jonathan, here's another." So the University College kept going through the war and emerged from the war with the view, a national view, that further education, higher education, was what this country deserved to expand after the war. The people coming back from the services deserved to have university education. And what was set up was the University Grants Committee, which was a government committee to receive applications from institutions that wished to become universities. And that was a distinction not freely given. You had to show that you had substance, that you had power, that you had possibilities. And my father worked and worked and worked with that committee to try and convince them of this issue. And of course, in the late 1940s, after the war, he won the argument and he got the nod that Leicester would indeed be given its own individual grant. And then he had a glorious time. I remember it very well because he kept coming in for lunch with his latest stories, which was he was being promised big money from the government. And he knew that the university block as it stood, big though it was not enough for a real university. And he had the promise from the Grants Committee of buying new properties. So suddenly, having been living on a very poor salary, I must say, he was going around Leicester. "Yes, I think so. I think it's a rather nice place. I think we might buy that." And one of the first places he bought was Knighton Hall. And then he bought various other properties around Oadby, which I dare say They became converted into students' accommodation, and I dare say there's a majority of people here that actually stayed in those buildings. It was a great time. Now, of course, we look back, and it was in 1951 that the University Grants Committee, and indeed the government, gave this distinguished university its charter. It had progressed from that small institution supported entirely by the citizens of Leicester on money, but citizens who would give support fees for local people just to go to the university. And now he was on the verge of it becoming a university, which it duly did in 1951, and my father, at that stage, retired. And I know, because he lived for many years thereafter, both with me and with my older brother, Richard, in turn, and I know how proud he was of this institution, and of how grateful he was to the citizens of Leicester for their huge generosity. They were generous, generous people. Perhaps I was nearer the mark when I said, thank you, St. Jonathan, and all the rest of them who helped this university become a university. Thank you.